How much time are you investing into learning Chinese? Most people don't actually know the answer to this question. Why is it a good idea to log your Chinese learning, and how should you go about it? Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to talk about logging your language learning. And this is something that seems to come quite natural to some people. Some people just like writing down what they are doing or otherwise tracking progress. And I'm certainly one of these people. For others, this seems like an extra thing that doesn't really do much, and in a sense that is true. You don't learn more Chinese by writing down how much you are doing. But as we shall see, there are some reasons you might want to consider logging your language learning. And this is a pretty big topic, and I have lots of things to say about it, so I'm going to split this into several episodes. And in this first episode, I'm going to talk about the basics of why language logging can be useful. And I'm also going to talk about some of the basic questions that comes up when you discuss logging, such as what do you actually log, what units do you use, and so on and so forth. Then in subsequent episodes, I will also discuss things in more practical terms. I will talk about how we categorize and balance language learning, and I will also go through tools and resources for language logging. So let's start with some reasons why logging your Chinese learning can be beneficial. So first out is that logging makes learning visible. And this is not so much a problem for beginners, because when you just started learning a new language, you will notice that your ability increases day by day. Or when you've studied a little bit, maybe week by week, then month by month. But after a certain time, you don't really feel any subjective difference. You don't feel that you are improving. So this is the intermediate plateau where you don't really feel that you are getting anywhere and that maybe you are stuck or you're doing something wrong. But usually it's just that you no longer notice your progress, because after all, if you learn, say, 50 words and you only know 100 words, that is an increase of 50%, and that is going to be very noticeable on the things that you use Chinese for in conversations or when you read or listen. Now, when you know 10,000 words, learning 50 extra words has almost no discernible impact on your ability at all. And so it doesn't mean that you're not learning things, it just means that in order to notice what you have learned, you need to do much, much more. So by writing down what you're doing, you can make sure that you are in fact learning, and you can also use this to track your progress, and it's kind of motivational to do so. Number two, logging provides an accurate record of your learning. So this is what I hinted at with the question at the beginning of this episode. So most people have a very hazy idea of how much time they spend doing things, and it's very hard to retroactively estimate how much time you've spent on something, like how much did I used to do this, say, last year or last month. Those types of questions are very difficult, so if you don't write down how much you're learning and what you're doing, you are very unlikely to be able to give good estimates. Now, if you sit down and do kind of a guided estimate where you think through each day what you normally do and so on, you can probably come up with a decent estimate, but it's still quite hard. This is of course important because if you don't know how much you're studying, it's very difficult to know what to expect from your learning. Now, if you feel that you aren't learning anything, well, maybe it's because you actually aren't studying as much as you should or as much as you think that you're doing. So being aware of how much you study is important. So I ran an experiment regarding this on Hacking Chinese a few years ago, where I asked people just casually first to try to estimate how many hours that they had spent learning Chinese over the years. And then I asked them to do the same thing, but go through it in a detailed or structured way where you kind of follow a procedure to try to get at a better estimate. And the result was that almost everybody overestimated how much time they actually spent learning. Okay, so moving on to number three. Logging makes analysis possible. And this is something that I will get into a lot more in the next episode about this. Essentially what I'm saying is that if you don't know where you are spending your time, it is very difficult for you, or indeed for anybody else, to have an opinion about what you're doing. So if you've never learned a foreign language, it might be tricky to figure out what things work and what quantities you should do certain activities and so on. And without a log over roughly what you're doing, it becomes very hard to give advice to people, and it also becomes very difficult for you yourself to figure out what works for you. So with a log, you can see what you're doing and you can have an opinion about it. And this is true for life in general, not just language learning. We typically have very hazy ideas of where we spend our time and how much. And this is why I, for example, in my course Hacking Chinese, a practical guide to learning Mandarin, there are steps to perform in order to analyze your time, what you're doing, and then figure out how you slot Chinese into this schedule or how you can make the most out of the time you have. All this involves logging. It involves somehow logging and then analyzing what you are doing. Number 4 is related to this, and this is indeed what we will cover in the next episode. So logging is necessary to balance different areas of learning. So depending on why you're learning Chinese, there are certain things that you might want to do a lot and other things that might not be so important for you. This is where you need to take responsibility for your own learning because no one else can really tell you this. Like I can say that if your goal is to, say, have a balanced language ability where you can do listening, speaking, reading, and writing, well, then you should probably do more of something than something else. But it could also be the case that in your specific situation, you need to be able to speak Chinese, but you don't need to be able to write that much, maybe. Or maybe it's the opposite. You care much more about being able to read Chinese than you do about pronouncing it accurately. If you're going to have an optimal approach for your specific situation, you need to be able to know where you're investing your time and to see if that makes sense. So the first step in figuring out if your language learning is balanced, i.e., are you doing the right types of activities considering what your goal is always to have a log so you know what you are doing at the moment. Number 5, logging allows you to set better goals. So goals are important for efficient learning because the goal is, after all, what we use to assess if something is working or if you're learning efficiently and so on and so forth. Without a goal, it becomes very difficult to talk about what methods are good, which are bad, and so on, because we don't have anything to compare with or any kind of standard to go by. Now, we all have different goals for learning, of course, and when setting your goal, especially in the short term, where you might say, this month I want to do this, or this week, or even today I want to do something, it is important that the goal is ambitious, but not too ambitious. The risk you're running if it's too ambitious is that you don't feel that you own the goal. You feel that this is something maybe imposed by someone else, or it's not realistic. You cannot envision yourself achieving it. And if that happens, you are very likely to give up. You need to know that this is something that you can do. On the other hand, if the goal is not ambitious enough, research also shows that people generally do less. Personally, I've experienced this many times, that if I set a goal that is just about right, I can do an awful lot of things. But if I set the bar too low, I definitely do less. Now, logging then is important because that gives you a baseline. If you log your learning, you know how much time you are spending. So for example, right now there is a listening challenge on, and if you're listening to this later, there is another challenge running, so you can just head over to Hacking Chinese Challenges to check out what's on at the moment. But the point is, you're asked here to set a goal for the month, for listening in this case. If you have no idea how much time you spend in a normal month when it comes to listening, it's very difficult to set an ambitious goal. Maybe you can say, okay, an hour a day sounds reasonable, but then you figure out that that was actually way too much considering how many other things you have been doing. And normally you maybe only listen to like 10 minutes every other day or something. So going up to an hour might be too ambitious. Now, for me, for example, I listen to a lot of audio, so I know that I can easily get an hour done every day. And then if I really wanted to focus on listening, I shouldn't go for an hour a day. I should go for something like an hour and a half, maybe even 2 hours if I have the time to spare. So logging here gives you a good picture of your own ability and what you're doing at the moment. And that then allows you to set goals that are more ambitious, which allow you to achieve more. Number 6, logging allows you to share your learning. And this is something that can be important for a number of reasons. You might want to share your learning with others so that they can give you advice. For example, when I coach people, I always ask them to do time logs and write things down, and I then look at what they've done. And if you don't do any logging, there is nothing to share. Well, you can tell me that, yeah, I do some listening here and I've read this and this, but this is way too vague to be useful. So you need this to be able to share it with other people. But it can also be very nice for accountability. So if you do your logging publicly, other people know that you're supposed to report your progress and someone will see what you're doing. And that can then increase your motivation to actually do what you have committed to doing. And this is something I like with Hacking Chinese Challenges, because since my progress is publicly visible, I kind of feel that I have to do the things that I've said that I would. So that's something that, at least for me, makes me more accountable and therefore definitely means that I spend more time learning. In addition, when you share things publicly, you can also, of course, feel encouraged by other people who say nice things or encouraging things to you, and you can also feel part of a larger community of other people who are learning. So there are many benefits of logging publicly. So if you've never logged your language learning, I hope that that list convinced you that there are at least some reasons for doing so and that you might want to try it out. I've been talking about time here mostly. We talked about how much time you spend learning Chinese and so on, but there's nothing really that says that time is the only option. There are many other things you could write down. So time is actually rather slippery. So for example, if we're going to record how much reading we're doing, we could, for example, write down, say, 51 minutes. But maybe it's tempting to round that off to an hour, maybe? Sounds better, looks better. Or maybe we keep counting the time even when we're not reading. Maybe we get a phone call or we go for a glass of water or something. And while that seems reasonable, it's also true that drinking water or taking a phone call in another language don't really contribute to your reading ability. However, the alternatives are actually worse in most cases, or so I've found at least. For example, we could count how much you read. That sounds pretty straightforward, right? Maybe how many chapters you've read or pages you've read in a book or something like that. And then it doesn't matter if you read for 51 minutes or 60 minutes. It's the amount of reading you do that counts. But this is also problematic because what we care about really is your engagement with the text itself, how much you understand and the meaning making that is involved. We're not really caring about how many characters your eyes pass over as you read. If that was the goal, you could just, read faster and it would look like you're learning more, and that is certainly not the case. So when I set up Hacking Chinese Challenges many years ago now, one thing that we discussed a lot was which units to use and which dimensions to use. So the dimensions here would refer to, for example, are we measuring time, or are we measuring how many units of Chinese you've covered, or something else? Time turned out to be the most practical one, and it's the only one I use these days to record progress for the challenges. And that's because that's the only really practical way to do it. Recording time is very simple, but recording units of Chinese of some other type is kind of tricky. So if we go back to the reading example, do you record number of pages? Seems a bit unfair. I mean, some pages have lots of characters, or if you print something with a bigger font, it counts as more. Okay then, so next step, let's look at characters then, the number of characters you read. But, well, then that means that you cannot really read things in a book, because then you have to spend lots of time trying to estimate how many characters you've read. It doesn't say in a normal book how many characters each page contains and so on. And this quickly gets very tedious. And logging is nice, but it's not meant to be the main thing you're doing. It's still the learning that is the point, right? So logging, if it becomes too tedious, just stops being very useful. So therefore, I've stuck with time for my own logging most of the time, and that's what I do for Hacking Chinese Challenges as well. It's also the case that the more detailed our measurements get, the more likely we are to actually overlook something. This can be neatly summarized by this quote from William Bruce Cameron, who said that not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that can be counted counts. So in terms of logging your language learning, that simply means that there are many activities that we engage in, that we want to engage in, but that are not easily counted. And it's also the opposite, of course, that some of the things that we can count might not even be important. And the more detailed our measurements get, the more risky it becomes. Now, using time to log our language learning has certain advantages, like we saw, but it also rests on certain assumptions. For example, we are assuming that spending more time leads to more learning. And this is at least superficially a reasonable assumption. Your method has to be really bad to have zero effect on your learning. But this is also an area which is pretty complicated and something that I can't really go into fully here, but I will bring it up a little bit again in the next episode. But you can't necessarily see that spending more time in one area will lead in improvements in that area. So for example, it could be that if your pronunciation is not very good, maybe you haven't spent enough time listening. You haven't established mental models for what these sounds are supposed to sound like. So listening is a key part of pronunciation, but if you just log your pronunciation practice, as in when you are trying to say things, maybe that's not where you should invest all your time if you want to improve your pronunciation. Another example might be that when you listen to Chinese and don't understand what's going on, maybe it is not actually your ability to perceive and parse the spoken language that is the problem, but simply that you don't know the words that they are using. And that is not strictly speaking a listening problem. It manifests itself in this area, but it would presumably also limit, say, your reading ability or your ability in many other areas. And your solution here might not be to just listen more to these things. They might be too hard for you. Maybe you should introduce these words and focus on them in some easier context. So my conclusion is that time is the most practical dimension to use for language logging like this. That doesn't mean that time is the only thing you can record, naturally. When you log your progress, you can log lots of other things. For example, what area of Chinese were you practicing? Is it listening, speaking, reading, or writing maybe? Or are there other systems to break the skills down? And this is something that I will cover in the next episode, so I won't say too much about it now. But beyond this, there are a couple of things that you might want to record as well. For example, when you reach a goal or a milestone, that might be nice to write down in your calendar. It feels motivational to do so, and you can also look back and see at your earlier achievements. Next, you can also record actual language and your comments about it. And this is much easier if you're doing your logging digitally, when you can include language, you can include recordings or links and so on and so forth. But for example, I read this article and this is what I thought about it. It was difficult, but I could get through it with the help of the dictionary or something like that. This is more akin to benchmarking, and I could say that the benchmarking is about the product, it's about your actual ability to do something, whereas logging here is more about the process, what you're doing and how much of it you're doing. But making notes that are related to benchmarking can also be motivational. And then you can go back and see, maybe from, say, a few months ago, you struggled with reading this type of article, but now you find it quite easy. Another nice thing to record is when you have questions or problems. And I've written about this before in an article called Why You Really Should Use a Chinese Notebook. And the main takeaway there is that if you write down your questions and your problems, it means that when you have time to sit down and deal with them, or you have access to a teacher or someone who can help you, it becomes much, much easier. It also makes sure that you don't forget about important things that you wanted to look up and so on and so forth. This is, of course, not something you have to do all the time, and you can also do this completely separately from the logging itself. Next up, we have noticeable effects on your language ability. So we talked about progress not being very noticeable once you get past the beginner stages, but sometimes there are qualitative differences in how your ability feels. Like you suddenly feel that you understand something you haven't understood before, or you feel that when you speak, something just clicks. These moments are also worth writing down. And finally, study hacks and learning strategies can also be interesting to write down. When you're trying out a new method or when you're doing something, just write down what you think about it and what you're doing. This also allows you to go back and see what you have done and see what worked and so on. Naturally, it's always hard to entangle different factors and variables and so on, but being conscious of how you're learning and paying attention to it so that you can then link it to what's going on and what your language learning, how it progresses, is definitely worthwhile. So now we've said a lot about what you can do with Language Log, but of course most people don't do all of these at once. Then language logging would be very tedious and it would take up an awful lot of time. For me personally, I'm happy if I write down how much time I spend and roughly what I've been doing. And for the Hacking Chinese challenges, which is mostly where I record my progress these days, I merely note down how much time it took and hopefully what I did. And that's enough for me. I think most people out there have their own systems for logging their progress. Some of you might not have done it at all, but I'd be delighted if you were willing to share your own experience with logging your language learning. So if you want to do so, you can just send me an email or say hi on social media, or you can go to Hacking Chinese and leave a comment to the article regarding this topic. And that, I think, is enough about language logging for one episode. Next time, we will talk more about how to categorize your learning and how to break it down and make sure that you get a balanced diet of Mandarin. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.